Peter. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's Geopolitics Forum entitled Roads to a New World Order. I'm delighted we have an excellent panel for you today with experts on the Middle East, China and Russia. And we'll have a conversation today both about some of the big picture issues facing the world and also about specific regions. To give a very brief introduction from your right, we have Henry Wang, who's a resident of Hong Kong, president of advisory firm Gate International, who's written books on energy, climate change, and business in China. Dmitry Trenin, director of the Carnegie Moscow Center since 2008, first Russian to hold that position. Jacqueline Lawson-Smith, a former British diplomat, specializing in Middle East and North Africa affairs. And Alistair Crook, director of Conflicts Forum, a geopolitical consultancy with 35 years of experience in the Middle East. So for an introduction, I don't think you need me to tell you that there's lots going on in the world, lots of turmoil. The point today is really to try and make some sense of it all in the half hour that we have and provide some pointers for you to help you navigate the months ahead. We're trying to make it a conversation rather than a series of questions, so we'll keep the number of questions fairly narrow. We'll have a mix, as I said earlier, of sort of general ones and specific regions. So to start with, well, not really an easy one, but to navigate what sort of changes there are to the world order. We all know there's lots of disruption in the world, the rise of populism, of economic nationalism, the breakdown of globalization. So the question for the panel is, where do we go from here? And what sort of world order do you see emerging? Is there any chance of it getting better, or is it just going to get more disruptive? So why don't we start with Alistair and then just open it up?
Thank you very much indeed. It is a tall order in a short period, but let's just do some highlights. I think this is the end of the period of single state hegemonies. We're going to see more of a concert of powers that are going to emerge in this next period. And in this, if you like, rather multi-power, if you like, concert of power structure, I think probably the United States is going to isolate itself more into an outsider status than into a leadership status as the relationship between Russia and China continues and develops in a new era, multipolar. Economically, we, I think, are going to see the breaking up of supply lines, a disentangling of economies that is going to take place. As a result, and driven very much by trade war and sanctions policies, are already creating it. It's like a root system being pulled apart. And that's going to have an effect on growth and on trade. And briefly on the Middle East, I think the Middle East is in a bad way economically and politically. And I think the defining factor is really going to be that everyone can see now that America is on the way out of the Middle East, is going to leave the Middle East. What will that do? I think it will actually make the prospects for security architecture better because with the American occupations of the Middle East slowly going from Afghanistan right through, and I know there's pushback at the moment, but ultimately, Pandora's box, the lid has been opened by Trump, and it's going to be quite difficult to shut it down completely. Therefore, Gulf states have no choice but to come to terms with Iran eventually and to find a security architecture which will be managed and led quite considerably by Russia and China. But the second part of it is really less positive. We're now in a post-industrial world for much of us. We've moved away from simple manufacturing and simple industries. And the hope for countries like Saudi Arabia and others to move away from oil to a new paradigm, this is not a good moment to do it. We're entering into recession, and the great competition between the big powers is for the commanding heights of new technical industry, technical manufacturing. And those that are trying to look for an edge into this, even Europe, probably won't get a look in. Thank you.
May I just pick up On one point Alistair mentioned, and perhaps just to throw a question back at Alistair, talking specifically, of course, about the Middle East, which is my focus. You mentioned that going forward, years to come, that America definitely will be much less of a presence there and much less influence. Is that what you're suggesting? I mean, I'm not necessarily sure that I hold sway with that. I mean, I think that much will depend, of course, on the future direction of US politics, to state the flaming obvious. But I'd just be interested, could you just expand a little bit on what you mean about the US in the Middle East?
Yes. I mean, I think this was a pivotal moment. After the downing of the American drone, there was no military response. And that has sent shockwaves through many of the states in the Middle East. Then there were the attacks on Al-Qaeda, on the Aramco facilities. And Trump didn't promise military action against anyone. He suggested they wanted a political solution and went to great lengths to meet with Rouhani at the UN, but which failed. And it is read and understood throughout the Middle East that this is something that is very clear. The United States did not take action after the attack on Aramco, did not take action after the downing of the drone. It does not want war in the Middle East. And the only possible solution to that for those states who have been hoping for a confrontation with Iran now is to outreach to Iran, and that's already happening. We've seen it from UAE and Saudi Arabia too.
I think I would, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, and then we'll maybe get...
I think I would just add to that. I think there's a huge amount of pragmatism in the region, of course, in the Middle East. I'm not sure that any country, when it comes to the brink of something happening, basically, ultimately war, outright conflict across states, I'm just not sure when it comes to that, and they're staring in the eyes of the potential for that anybody wants that. I mean, you talk about those who hope for confrontation, at least in order to get Iran back in its box, big time. I'm not sure. I don't necessarily buy into that. And I think for anyone in the region, war would be ultimately, full-scale war, would be not in anyone's interests at all. And the US, why didn't they react after those attacks? I think there was notwithstanding Trump and whatever he thinks he's going to say tomorrow and what his position will be tomorrow, I think overall the US has taken a very pragmatic position on the region too. As I say, I must stress, notwithstanding Trump and where he's going.
I mean, that was the recognition that people don't want war.
So in terms of a reshaping of sort of moving into a more multipolar world, that a reshaping of alliances, I mean, from your perspective, Dimitri and Henry, the new world order that is emerging, how it's changing fundamentally.
Thank you, David. I largely agree with what Alistair has said. A couple of comments. You mentioned, David, that you mentioned the word roads leading to the new world order. There are no roads. We are at sea. And the new order will not emerge before the rivalry, which is getting sharper between and among the major players, certainly between the United States and China in the first place, but other nations, including Russia and some others, are also taking part. So we're at the beginning of a period of high turbulence, and I think we'll see more turbulence as we move along the way to the new order. So it will be more disruptive. It will be more interesting in the years and decades ahead. Concept of powers, I think, could be the end state, the ideal end state of this new period. This will be In other words, this is a description of a new world order that will be produced by this major struggle among the or major competition, a rivalry among the principal players. I think we're a little bit back to the, I joked at the beginning of 2000 that whereas the entire world moved from the 20th century to the 21st century, Russia moved back, chose the other door and moved into the 19th century from the 20th century. My conclusion today is that the world is following in that direction, led by the United States. And I don't think that it will all go back to normal after Donald Trump ceases to be president of the United States. The Donald Trump legacy, America first, will stay on. And whoever gets elected as new president to succeed Mr. Trump. The New World Order, I think, will be more multidimensional. It's one thing to talk about geopolitics. It's slightly another thing to talk about geostrategic relationships. It's a totally different thing to talk about geoeconomics. Say Europe is a major, is an geoeconomic superpower, but it's not a strategic player in the world still dominated by nation states, by big nation states. With regard to the Middle East, I think that, again, I very much agree with the analysis by Alistair. The inaction, the lack of response by the United States to several developments in the Gulf is a reality check. Thank God we never had that reality check during the Cold War. But I think that the chance of the United States actually getting involved in a conflict on behalf of its ally was so much greater in the days of the Cold War than it is now. But now I think it's becoming very clear that basically the United States will defend its own interest and protect its interest. But interests of the United States will be different from the interests of the system over which the United States has presided for a long time. And that is a sea change. The two went along for a fairly long time, and now I think they have separated. And I do not see them coming back together. And that's a message to be essentially thought about, particularly by US allies all over the world. And lastly, the New World Order will not be based on rules. So the idea of a rules-based order essentially is the idea of a world regulated by rules developed by the more developed part of the world and sort of presented or imposed, as the case may be, on the rest of the world. It will come to an end. And it will be, I think, replaced by a world based on agreement among the major players, a negotiated world rather than a world that sort of abides by certain rules.
Henry?
Thank you very much, David. And I like to, in terms of the world order, I like to talk about the continual rise of Asia-Pacific as a global power of influence. I was very honored to be invited by Lord Howell and the Windsor Energy Group to talk about this to the leading ambassadors to the UK at Windsor Castle early on this year. And really, if you look at the situation as it develops on an optimistic scenario, you will see that China and India are rising to be the second and third largest economies in the world. Already China is the second largest. And looking ahead in the medium term, China could become the largest economy in the world. And also in exciting time, there's also other exciting developments in the region. For example, last month when I was invited to speak in Philippines to the international CEO conference there with 600 delegates from Asia-Pacific area, you know, there are tremendous achievements being made. For example, Philippines is now overtaken India to be the checkbox capital of the world with almost more than 1 million employees working in the checkbox area. And also Google now have come out and said that Asia-Pacific will be the fastest growing e-commerce and digital centers, growth center with the world with drive engines like it is. And in addition, I mean, this is an energy conference, and we already heard about the CEO of Aramco and Shell talking about clean energy and the fossil to energy transition. And a lot of things are happening there in China with with being leaders in solar investments and renewable investments. But I want to give you a balanced picture because I've talked about the positives. We should also talk about when I advise boards and international companies, I always like to give a balanced picture, and there are some risks. To name a few risks, for example, there are tremendous geopolitical tensions that are building up in the area, for example, South China Sea, which we can discuss later on. In addition, of course, everybody is very familiar with the ongoing trade war, the US-China trade war, which I'm happy to discuss more later on. But very importantly, there's also the age profile in China. There's tremendous, in the West, we talk about the aging population, but the same is true for some of the leading economies in Asia Pacific, Japan, China, but the governments are aware of this and are handling this, improving the social infrastructures, providing social investment, changing the retirement to retain talents. We're talking about young talents. A lot of the CEO talk about recruitment of talents, but I want to bring in also the retention of aged talents, people over 50, 60, which have tremendous amount of contribution they could make to corporate growth and also talent, education, and sharing. So I think this, I will end there, and this gives a picture where there is a tremendous engine of growth, but there are some risks which could derail this high-speed train, so to speak, and we can talk about that more later on.
Henry, any other?
Can I, in this new format of the participants in meeting, Dimitri, I wanted to ask you, you said no rules are likely to exist in this new multiplicity of powers that's coming into being. It isn't there yet, of course, which I agree. But what role do you see in the fact that actually the West is at war over its values? It is virtually in a low-intensity civil war over its own values. Is that going to give space for other values to come into that, if you like, that new order by agreement? Because, and I think Putin, who noted that what we're witnessing at the moment, and you may like to amplify, is that liberalism has become obsolete for the rest of the world.
Liberalism, I think, will not become an extinct species, I don't think.
I didn't say.
But what I think Putin could have meant, and certainly something that I would agree with, is that liberalism has ceased to be this unifying concept.
Exactly.
Across the world. It will continue to exist in certain areas, in certain countries, even if in some of those, including some of the leading countries, it will be engaged in a cultural values conflict with conservatism and other, let's say, more, because it's not just liberalism, it's the liberalism of the globalization age. It's very different from the liberalism of the 19th century.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? And I think that this is, yes, it's the countries that belong to the area of the world where liberalism still prevails will have to take account of the end of the liberal hegemony in the world. And whereas they may still structure their own relationships largely on liberal terms within this area, they will have to be to act differently when they talk to or when they deal with countries such as China, such as India, such as Russia, such as many other countries around the world. They will have to deal on a different basis, and that basis can only be bargaining on the basis of your interests. So a negotiated order, in other words.
Okay, well, thank you all. A fascinating discussion, but time is tight, so let's turn to a few areas of direct interest to the energy industry, and we'll try and keep it succinct. First on US-China, a question for Henry. A great direct and indirect in terms of oil demand and LNG sales, oil sales. The US-China trade war, is there a chance of resolution, do you think, or is it a more fundamental struggle at play here?
Well, that's a very topical question. And at this moment in time, I think in the short term, we will see a lot of actions in the next few days and weeks. There is the planned resumption of the trade discussions and negotiations. But also I'd like to bring to your attention, there will be things which could add more to the global tension and made with geopolitical tensions. There will be the addition of more Chinese company to the entity list, to the US entity list. There are plans also from China to publish the unreliable companies, which could also add to the ongoing discussions. But I think I like to keep looking ahead on an optimistic basis and keep the big picture in mind. I think this is very important that for the New World Order and for harmonious developments in the world order, that we try to minimize conflict and come to a solution, a win-win solution. There are many good things happening. I mean, in my latest book, on renewables, I see there is tremendous cooperation between US companies and Chinese companies on developing and sharing of renewable and clean energy expertise and also in projects which could benefit both countries. Apple, for example, has doing a tremendous amount of research in the digital areas and artificial intelligence, which they have said they see a tremendous value in China, and they like to continue this. So I hope the leaders, when they talk about their national interests, can also bear in mind the global interests and come to a balanced view.
That's hope. I mean, are there any counterpoints there that hope of a resolution may be misplaced from the other members of the panel? Or let's move on to US-Iran then. Question for Jacqueline and Alistair. I'll make it simple. Do you think we are looking at a negotiated solution, an extended war of attrition, or an accidental war? Jacqueline, why don't you go first?
Goodness. I don't think we're looking at, I think you gave a list of questions, but I don't think war. I don't.
Pick one.
Pick one. I think there will be an extended period of the status quo for now. I think that Iran is not going to lose its vision of what it sees its role is in the region and more broadly. I think for the US, there has to be a pullback from the existing situation. I mean, I don't need to state in this room the folly of the withdrawal of the US from the nuclear deal. But I mean, that of itself is the issue at the heart of this. We need somehow to get the players back to bringing this back on track and seeing this through. Iran will continue to have its ambitions across the region. It will not wish to continue to be vilified in public and to be pilloried as it has been. So there has to be a solution.
It sounds like you're leaning towards the first, some sort of negotiated solution.
Yes, I am.
Is there?
Well, I'll take the rather counterintuitive position, which is that I don't believe Iran as a whole, and by that I mean by both the leadership, but importantly the people, actually now are interested in a deal with the United States any longer. They've been there, we were through this, I was involved with it over the decades, and the thought of wearily going through that whole process again, Iran, I think, feels that it's on a new track and going a different way. It's going to find different solutions to this problem of where it is going. Doesn't want to go back into that whole exercise with the United States because it's been proven. And it certainly can't go back into it now because it's not possible for a president to lift sanctions on Iran because they are the prerogative of Congress. And Congress, in the midst of impeaching the president, is not going to help the president anyway. So there's no way of going back to a negotiated process at this point, but I don't think even in the longer term. And there really has, what I hear from Iranians everywhere, been a change in mood in Iran. People are actually, feeling quite proud of how Iran has handled this process. Originally, the economy was going down quite sharply about 4 or 5 months ago, but the rial has risen, it's back where it was. The economy is certainly not booming, but it's certainly not imploding either. It's steady, manufacturing is steady, and they are selling enough oil for the moment. I think, though, to answer all your questions, is that it probably is going to get worse next month. Because next month, then Iran will go to the next stage of, if you like, not complying with the JCPOA. And the next stage of non-compliance may then provoke the Europeans into trying to have some response or feeling that they must take some response against Iran. And then tensions will occur. And who knows, we may find that Ansar Allah or some other group is taking action in the Middle East against oil or other infrastructure projects. So I think it may, if it doesn't get better, by getting better I mean the US change its position in the next few months, then it will get a lot worse.
I would just pick up on one thing, Alistair, and say that I think in terms of the Iranian economy at the moment, inflation is running at over 40%.
It's come down a lot from that. It's come down from 40 to about 28, 30.
Well, I think it's still internally not a happy situation.
Sounds like Alistair would vote for an extended stalemate unless something changes in the next few weeks, with the possibility of things getting much worse. Would that be, or at least worse?
Correct.
Correct. Dimitri, last question before we open it up to the floor. Thinking, well, what should I ask? I thought, well, what's Russia up to in the Middle East? And then I actually noticed you'd written a book with that very title, What's Russia up to in the Middle East? So in 2 minutes, please, what is Russia up to in the Middle East? And in particular, will the OPEC-Saudi alliance survive?
Well, I think that beyond its borders, Russia is essentially pursuing its national interest. It has no particular interest in imposing solutions on other countries, other regions. As the Soviet Union, they tried to come up with its own version of the global order, or the world order. Today, they can't care less. They care about their own place. They don't care much about the world order. They care about their place in the world order. And that's the principal distinction. In the Middle East, again, they are promoting their own interest, which is a security interest, economic interest, and several other interests that Russia is pursuing. And that gives Russia enormous capability to reach out to essentially all players in the region. Mr. Putin has just had some time, FaceTime with, they sat down together with President Rouhani of Iran. He's going to Saudi Arabia in the next couple of days. They talk to Israel, very intimate relationship. They talk to Iran, they talk to Hezbollah, they talk to the Kurds, they talk to everyone. And everywhere they pursue their own national interest. And that, I think, will continue to be the key to Russia's, I would say, modest and yet real success in the Middle East. And through the Middle East, Russia has established itself as as a world power, again, at least in the perception of so many others who had dismissed it as a regional actor.
Thank you. Well, I would love to keep the conversation up here going, but aware of the time, I'd like to open it up to the floor, see if there are any questions from the floor in the last 5 minutes or so. We have one over there. And please state your name and affiliation before the question. Thank you.
Good morning, Julien Matonnière, Energy Intelligence. First of all, thank you to the panel for this very insightful presentation. My question maybe is for Mr. Trenin. You said that we were at the beginning of a new era of turbulences that would be very disruptive. And I'm trying to relate that to what Ben van Beurden said earlier today about the geopolitical risk premium and the fact that it was very low at the moment regarding crude oil prices. Does that mean that the oil markets are a bit short-sighted in terms of how they price geopolitical risk at the moment?
So the question is the oil market underappreciating the extent of geopolitical risk in the market? For Dimitri, but I think anyone else who would like to weigh in.
Well, I think that all markets, by definition, have a short-sighted view. They do not look 10 years ahead or 100 years ahead. They look at what's happening right now, what may happen tomorrow or the day after, but not very much beyond that. I think that the geopolitical risks that exist and that are very substantial, in my view, should not be seen as leading easily to a catastrophe, to where we were during the Cold War. I think we learned a lot from the Cold War period. And if you look at not the most consequential relationship, major power relationship that exists today, but certainly the most dangerous one between Russia and the United States, it's as bad as you can imagine. And it will get worse before it gets worse, in my view. But there's a safety net. We won't have a nuclear war. We'll have a very, very bad relationship, but not a nuclear war. Similarly with the United States and China. So although the adversity will be on the increase in the US-China and US-Russia relationships, I don't think we will see an actual military collision that was very likely during the Cold War. So I think I will stop here.
Yes, I'd just like to reply, because you said in that comment that you quoted, he said maybe there are other factors, that maybe it's coming down. And I would say the other factor is really what is apparent very much in Europe, less so in America, although it started, is recession. And global trade is falling everywhere. And you can see it. At the moment, I think it's not properly acknowledged because people are attributing this to rather the turbulence of Trump's trade wars and the China relationship, and thinking in Europe it's about Brexit, and all of this will clear away and then we'll go back to growth. But that's not really what the statistics, the data are showing. It shows that we've already, in Europe, we're already in a manufacturing recession and are starting a services recession in Europe at the moment. And the European Union has been very slow to recognize it. And I think that's the factor the markets are seeing much more than, if you like, the world at large are recognizing.
I'd like to add one point to that. I think there is rising geopolitical risk, certainly in the crude markets and the gas markets, but also the big importing countries are aware of this geopolitical risk and have taken policy actions and government actions in order to mitigate against these risks. I've covered this in my book on the energy markets in emerging economies, and a good example is the new crude diversification strategy by China. It has actively diversified crude supply. It's taken in crude from Russia, from other countries, to the extent now that Russia is now the number one biggest crude importer to China, whereas Saudi Arabia is now lower in its import list. That's a good example of what countries are doing to try to balance their risk and to, as part of their enterprise management system, as we do in all the multinational companies.
Thank you, Henry. Now, the clock is telling us we're out of time. I know we are trying to make up time and keep to the schedule. I would like to thank our colleagues, our panelists, but assure you that if you have any further questions, they will be around in the coffee break, and so I would encourage all of you just to approach them in the coffee break or later today to continue the conversation. So with that, I would just thank you all. Please join me in thanking the panel today, and I will hand back to Peter Kemp.